Pacem in Terris, meaning peace on earth, was a letter written by Pope John XXIII in 1963, adding to the social teaching of the Church. John XXIII was near the end of his life in 1963, and the Church was in the middle of a huge process of renewal, the Second Vatican Council. It was also the time of the Cold War, and in 1962 was the Cuban Missile Crisis, a standoff in the Caribbean between the Soviet Union and the United States militaries. The nuclear armory of each side had become immense, and the possibility of nuclear war was very palpable to people at the time. It's worth looking up Father Peter Coughlan's blog on the Independent Catholic News about Pacem in Terris, which was published in April 2023, which gives a lot of the detail of this context. The letter didn't propose any diplomatic or strategic solutions to the crisis, but these crises form the backdrop to its messages, and it was addressed not just to Catholics, but to all people of goodwill. In contrast to the brittle truce of the Cold War based on the threat of mutually assured destruction, what the Pope sought to do with this letter was to invite us to contemplate the divine order on which true peace can be founded. So what does that mean? When we look at the natural world, maybe we are awestruck by the sheer force of the oceans, the rivers, the vastness of blue whales, the ferocity of predators. Yet, Pacem in Terris points to the marvellous order that holds all of these forces in balance. It says that it's not these sheer forces of nature, but actually the limits upon them that sustains life and reflect the handiwork of God. When we turn our attention to the relationships between humans, the letter says that there is a stark contrast. Our destructive tendencies seem at times to be limitless. I quote, "It would seem as if human societies were governed only by force." Reflecting on our limitless destructive potential, he must have had in mind the example of nuclear weapons. But also perhaps he had in mind that tendency for conflict to continue for decades, even when each side may have forgotten the original reason for fighting. Nevertheless, the fighting goes on to avenge the already dead. And of course, we are now also confronted with our own lack of limits when it comes to consumption and the plundering of land and labour that has caused climate change and spiralling debt. Our lack of a sense of limit has put even the forces within our economies and ecosystems out of balance. Pacem in Terris says that though we can't look to the animal kingdom to find the order that could secure peace between people, we can find it inscribed in our hearts. So we're talking here about principles, and in particular, for this encyclical, Pacem in Terris, the principles of universal human rights. So, the Catholic take on human rights is unpacked in this letter. Here we have a vision of every person being made in the image of God. Each person is thus entitled not only to equal opportunities, but also to protection and care in hard times when opportunities are scarce. Each person also has the right to develop their talents and to choose a vocation. We might call this a thick rather than a thin sense of human rights, of what is due to each human being. Because of that, these rights depend upon duties. They don't get guaranteed by magic, but by other people stepping in and going the extra mile to grant what is owed to each person. So that's a brief introduction to what Pacem in Terris was all about. I want to now bring in Aisling from Pax Christi International and invite her to talk a bit more from a peacemaker's perspective. So the question I want to ask you, Aisling, is what has happened since 1963? What's changed in the field of peacemaking? So can you tell us a bit about the big changes or maybe the big setbacks as well?
Thank you, Francis. So since 1963 and the release of the document, the world has changed enormously. And yet in many ways, much of what is said in the encyclical is still so relevant today. So what have been some of the changes and shifts since this time? Hopefully, I'll be touching a little bit on the issues of war and diplomacy, nuclear weapons, protests, rights, and the church and non-violence. Sadly, I think we're all aware that war and conflict are still very present in the world today. And whilst there have been shifts in what this looks like, the call for the world to work for the common good and to act justly is still needed. Since 1963, conflicts have continued. Indeed, the Iron Curtain, the backdrop of this encyclical in Europe, only came down in 1991, and many ideological tensions still exist. As much as we have seen countries gain perhaps independence, the recognition of maybe indigenous or minority groups in certain parts of the world, we've also seen kind of wars across continents, civil wars, dictatorships, and military coups. The encyclical mentions the United Nations as one way of working together, and despite recognition both then and now that it's not perfect, along with other international bodies and organisations, we've seen both the power of diplomacy and where a lack of diplomatic will can fall short. In the UK, we've seen what can happen when people come together with the will to end conflict, with the example of the Good Friday Belfast Agreement, although currently we're also seeing the potential fragility of that peace. The conflict in Ukraine is also bringing new challenges. So Pacem in Terris, with its call for respecting other groups and nations and working for the good of all, can still be a guide, I think, for leaders in working for peace today.
Thanks so much, Aisling, for unpacking some of that detail for us. A question that I'd also like to ask you is, so Pacem in Terris was quite, broke new ground in the sense that it was part of the Catholic adoption of human rights discourse. I'm just wondering if you can talk a bit about the relevance of human rights to our globalized world today.
Thank you. So I think, and it's mentioned in the document, you know, the role of the United Nations, and I think the United Nations has been key for international law and for human rights, and you know, it's also had kind of peacekeeping roles across the world, despite sometimes arguably it maybe not being so effective. And that role as a driver of human rights is something that I'll potentially come back to a bit later. But it's true that both before and after the encyclical, and since the 1960s, we've seen many kind of treaties and international laws for the protection of kind of human rights and the environment. So, you know, I've seen the Convention Against Torture, the Treaty on the Protection of the Ozone Layer, Convention on the Rights of the Child, amongst many others, that kind of the aim is the protection and to ensure a peaceful and healthy planet. And we can also see that international law, both UN kind of, and other international laws, can be applicable nationally. So, for example, with the current cases against the government regarding sending people seeking asylum to Rwanda, and also that idea of working nationally to change things internationally with a campaign against the arms trade, bringing cases against the government to try and stop arms sales to Saudi Arabia. Now, according to the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, the UK was the 7th largest global arms exporter from 2018 to 2022. And in 2021, the world military expenditure passed $2 trillion for the first time. And we've also seen that since the beginning of the conflict in Ukraine, military spending in Europe has increased, with calls for kind of arms deals kind of making headlines. And so militarism is still, I think, something that's very present in our lives. And this acts as a challenge to peacemaking, but also invites us to rethink what security could mean, and particularly in terms of those rights and duties, and I think internationally as well, that Pope John speaks about.
Fascinating question, what security could mean. And it brings me to think about another very specific threat that Pacem and Terris dwells upon a lot, that is nuclear weapons, nuclear war. So where are we at today with this debate about nuclear weapons?
Yes, so in the encyclical, Pope John XXIII calls very clearly for the banning of nuclear weapons against this backdrop, as you've mentioned, the Cold War, although he sort of also maybe seems to accept that perhaps their complete destruction isn't sort of possible anytime soon, particularly without that kind of political or moral will. But currently we've got, Pope Francis, who is a very loud advocate for nuclear disarmament. Indeed, he's unequivocal, calling the possession of nuclear weapons immoral. And despite this, in many ways, we can kind of see where the situation hasn't necessarily changed so much. So although absolute numbers of nuclear missiles have gone down since the Cold War, over the last few years, we've kind of seen these tensions stoked, between North Korea and the USA, and again with that kind of invasion of Ukraine by Russia. We still seem to be at the mercy of these weapons of mass destruction being held as bargaining tools. The doomsday clock is closer to midnight than it's ever been. And we have seen many treaties and agreements aimed at curbing nuclear weapons. So there was a non-proliferation treaty in 1968. But I think one of the big changes has been in 2021, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons kind of entering into force, which means that nuclear weapons are now illegal under international law. And today, 92 countries have signed the treaty and 68 countries have ratified the treaty. And the Vatican was amongst the first of the countries to do that. So I think that's very much the Church being a leading voice there. And although the UK is still to sign and still being a country that has nuclear weapons, cities such as Leeds, Leicester and Edinburgh have signed an appeal from the International Campaign Against Nuclear Weapons to put pressure on the government. And over the years, we've seen the banning of biological weapons, of chemical weapons and landmines through advocacy and international law. But that advance in technology, with that advance, we can't be complacent. I think despite, kind of treaties coming into practice, we're actually seeing that, with drones, robots, AI, there are new frontiers opening for warfare.
I mean, some of the things you mentioned there, they really evoke this kind of world of proliferating instruments of death and, the likes of AI and drones. They seem to be things that Pope John XXIII couldn't have even anticipated, some of them. It would be good to hear from you, though, what some of the counter movements, against these things, these hopeful movements of change in the world are today.
So despite kind of war and conflict seeming ubiquitous, it is interesting that actually, according to research from Erica Chenoweth and Maria Stephen, change through non-violent means is actually statistically more successful than kind of this violent change, if you like. So alongside war and conflict, we've seen opposition to war using a range of non-violent methods. So, protests against nuclear weapons at Greenham Common, and global protests against the Iraq War in 2001. So that idea of non-violent resistance, it has a long history, and it's still continuing today. So, and they're using methods that still challenge and call attention to injustice and immorality. So these methods that have kind of happened in the past that we're still seeing today, they often share many similarities, I think, but are molded to almost suit the needs or the context of the time that we find ourselves in, as well as the creativity of the peacemakers around. So I think in April, we saw tens of thousands of people, including CAFOD supporters and Pax Christi members, take part in the big one with Extinction Rebellion, calling for climate justice for our planet. And I think there's the idea, isn't it, of there will be no peace without climate justice. And as we're faced with this kind of climate crisis, I do think we're seeing a new generation of young people really challenging the systems of injustice through protest and through non-violent resistance. But I think it's important to also remember that peace isn't just about the absence of war. As you mentioned at the very beginning, Francis, the encyclical talks a lot about our rights and our duties, and the need for these rights and duties to be protected and respected by people and states. Peace is about ensuring these rights that we can all live in justice. So interestingly, despite the fact the language of the encyclical isn't particularly inclusive, the document does comment on the rights of women, and it might seem a little outdated to us with women now, not just being seen as wives and mothers, but despite women being better represented and with legislation requiring equal rights, these rights are still actually being fought for worldwide, particularly in places such as Iran and Afghanistan. And the document also states that racial discrimination is unacceptable. It calls for its abolition. But despite this, we still see that people are facing racism and xenophobia on a daily basis. And we've seen the civil rights movement in the USA, the end of apartheid in South Africa, but more recently we've seen the Black Lives Matter movement. And I think more work is needed to really ensure racial justice in our world. And in fact, I think many minority groups of all kinds are still really fighting for their rights. Society in the last few decades have made great strides in working towards equality, yet we've still got so much to do on a national and international level. And in many ways, in today's world, and here in the UK, we have more ways to be active participants in civil society, through and building on that decades of activism and hard work that have come before us. But actually, we can see that recent developments, such as changes to the crime and policing bill, for example, have highlighted that worry that I think these rights can be infringed upon, and keeping that awareness alive, I think. And furthermore, though global poverty has decreased since 1963, we're still no nearer to really ensuring that everybody has access to adequate food, to shelter, to water. We see famine and conflict over resources, and that'll only really get worse with the climate crisis. Closer to home, we can see the effect of the current cost of living crisis and inequality in our society through homelessness, and the use of food banks. But it's organisations, I think, such as CAFOD and Caritas, the SVP, have done such great work, I think, over the years, and still this work continues. And I think without this, this work for justice, our society and our world will never really be a peaceful one.
Thanks, Aisling. It's great to be reminded of all the Catholic organisations being called upon to be part of that peacemaking process, and it just left me wondering, for Pax Christi, where do you see the spirit moving within the church at the moment?
Right, yeah, I think so. I have to admit I'm no theologian or historian, but I think over the last 60 years, the church itself has really moved. So since this encyclical was written, we've seen the outcomes of the Second Vatican Council revolutionising the church, and we've also seen the church grapple with growing secularization in many countries across the world. So Pax Christi International is working to explore more deeply the theology of nonviolence, and standing on the work of many theologians and peacemakers over the last few decades. And I think this is also kind of growing within the church. So in April, the Pope made creating a culture of nonviolence his prayer intention for that month. And with this call to nonviolence and a growing understanding of what that is, what nonviolence is, we can see how there's been a shift in maybe the church exploring if we can still have, I think, a just war theory. And Pope Francis' words on the nature of war and peace, and his encyclicals on, Laudato Si and Fratelli Tutti, I think call us to explore for ourselves what a theology of nonviolence would really look like for the church and for the world. So I think although that the world is kind of constantly changing and shifting, sometimes even seemingly going backwards, potentially politically or socially or economically, but that need to work for those rights and duties, all of it never goes away, and neither does the call to work for the peace. In the midst of what's been called a war fought piecemeal, I think there's a real calling for us to carry on working for peace, to use nonviolence and those teachings found, the teachings of the church found in Pacem and Terris.
Thanks so much, Aisling. And it's really sobering. I mean, it's fascinating. It's fascinating to have that kind of detailed analysis. It's also quite depressing and sobering, isn't it? And I think, as he said, we've heard this phrase from Pope Francis: a third world war fought piecemeal, and also the sense of the brittleness of what might be called progress. And so now I just want to move into a slightly different kind of space, to think a little bit about what real peace, what the real promise of peace is, as we understand it from the gospel. So Jesus says, "Peace I leave with you, my peace I give you. I do not give it to you as the world gives it. Do not let your hearts be troubled, and do not be afraid." He stands in sharp contrast to, I think, what we've heard. But I guess this reminder that the peace Jesus promised was a peace that the world cannot give is important, isn't it? Because it shows that it's not based on a kind of optimism or a faith in some notion of progress, or dependent upon the powers that be, some kind of promise that they'll get rid of the bad guys. Instead, our hope is grounded in Jesus, who didn't retaliate when crucified as a criminal, and yet mysteriously conquered death. So in this next part of our webinar, Ashley and I wanted to explore some inspirational peacemakers of the past and of the present, icons of peace, if you like, who, like Jesus, can nourish the shared mission of Pax Christi and CAFOD in their witness. So, St. Oscar Romero of El Salvador. When he was made Archbishop of San Salvador in a time of fierce conflict over land, supporters of the repressive military saw St. Oscar as a safe bet, really. He was a friend to the poor, and when his friend Rutilio Grande was killed by the death squads, he began to recognize the violence as a repression of the coffee harvesters, the landless campesinos who were striving for dignity by freely associating among themselves for better working conditions. And he became a strong advocate for the campesinos, and aired some very challenging homilies on the archdiocesan radio station, which was several times bombed. In 1980, he was assassinated while saying Mass. And his homily the day before, he addressed the military directly and said, "You are killing your own brother and sister campesinos, and against any order a man may give to kill, God's law must prevail. You shall not kill. No soldier is obliged to obey any order against the law of God."
So this is Blessed Franz Jägerstätter and his wife Franziska. So Franz Jägerstätter was an Austrian farmer who found himself called up to fight during the Second World War. But his faith led him to the conclusion that he couldn't fight in the war whilst also following his faith. So he refused to fight, and in doing so became a conscientious objector. But because of this, he was put to death in August of 1943. He was beatified in 2007 as a martyr for his faith, but is also recognised as a hero for peace. However, I think that when sharing the story of Franz, it's important also to reflect on the role of his wife, Franziska. Franziska supported Franz in his decision, but she also had to face the consequences. So she was left with a farm to look after and 3 young children, and often shunned by her local community. But she was really proud of the decision that Franz took, and her and her daughters shared his story. So I think there's a kind of an example there that actually as peacemakers, often it's about, supporting each other, it's working together, not doing things as individuals. So both Franz and Franziska found themselves in a time of war and conflict. And they both responded in the way that they felt they were called, but I think facing the particular challenges of their time, their conflict, and their context, really. So this is Sister Wamuyu Wachira. So Sister Wamuyu is currently co-president of Pax Christi International. She's a Loreto sister and has worked as a teacher and head teacher in Kenya. And as a role as teacher and head teacher, she encouraged peaceful relationships between her students, looking at dialogue, looking at reconciliation, to really promote those ideas of equality, of respect and of dignity. But when she was faced with episodes of violence that she saw happening in schools, she decided to try and see really what lay at the root of that, and that led to kind of a PhD and further study. And now she lectures in peace and conflict studies at St Paul's University in Nairobi, as well as coordinating the Justice, Peace and Integrity of Creation kind of Eastern Africa province. On top of all that, she's also worked with some of Pax Christi International's initiatives. So I think particularly in the Great Lakes region of Africa, there's kind of a project training young people in non-violence, and also in some cases encouraging entrepreneurship as an alternative to violence. And offering this alternative to violence or kind of skills in some way is key for making peace, not just peace being a nice word, but making peace actually a viable option. And I think that, like Franz and Franziska, Sister Wamuyu has responded to the situation that she has found herself in to work for peace, working in her own context, critically analysing what surrounds her to ask actually how she can work for peace and how peace can be achieved, particularly by offering an alternative to violence.
And it's almost as if that theme of alternatives to violence is a kind of golden thread linking all of these examples of who we're calling icons of peace. It's what I feel I've been learning from engaging with you, Ashley, and Pax Christi's materials is, as well as some of CAFOD's partners' work, is a sense that peacemaking is not always about negotiating ceasefires or even international treaties, as important as those things are. It can also be about what people are doing instead of fighting. And so Aisling and I just wanted to end this recording, this webinar for you, with a brief video, which should be self-explanatory, but it depicts some of CAFOD's partners in Colombia, and it's an example of how people can come together to kind of join together in a common practice and a common belonging in order to work for peace. So thanks very much for listening, and we'll just leave you with this final video.